We all make plans for the future. We plan our careers, our vacations, our finances, but what about the really big stuff? What happens when a time comes that we can't actually speak for ourselves anymore? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dive into the promises we make to our future selves and what happens when those promises get incredibly complicated.
So just imagine for a second that you write this down. It's so clear, right? It's a powerful statement of who you are and what you want. Seems pretty simple. You've laid out your wishes, plain as day. But what if the person you become isn't that fighter anymore? What happens if that person is actually happy, enjoying the simple things in life, even if they have no memory of who they used to be? Now that is the central puzzle we're going to try and unpack together. So let's dive right in with our first section, a promise for the future. This is all about planning for that moment when you might lose what we call decision-making capacity. The go-to tool for this is something called an advance directive. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like a message in a bottle that you send to your future doctors and your family. It could be a super specific living will, or it could just be appointing someone you trust to make those calls for you. Essentially, it's your voice, projected forward in time. Okay, so there have to be rules for this kind of thing, right? And of course there are. Let's take a look at Section 2, the official rulebook. Ethicists and lawyers have actually put together a framework to help us navigate these really tough situations. And it really boils down to two main ideas. On one hand, you've got what's called substituted judgment. This is all about trying our best to figure out what the patient would have wanted if they could tell us. It's about respecting their autonomy, their past self. Then on the other hand, there's the best interest standard. This one asks a different question. What's just generally good for the patient right now? It's all about the principle of beneficence, just doing good. So this leads to a pretty standard hierarchy, sometimes called the orthodox view. It's a three-step process. Step 1, you always honor a clear advance directive. If you don't have one, you move to Step 2, apply substituted judgment. What would they have wanted? And then, only as a last resort, if you have absolutely no clue, you fall back to Step 3, their general best interests. It seems so logical, so clean. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite. And that brings us to Section 3, where we see exactly why this isn't so simple. This is where the rules start to get fuzzy, and the first big challenge comes from a group of people often called the never competent. See, for individuals who've never had the capacity to make these kinds of complex decisions, we're talking about young children or people with certain severe congenital disabilities. You can't use substituted judgment. It's impossible. There is no past autonomous self whose decisions you can try to reconstruct. So what do? Do you just slap a generic best interest standard on it and call it a day? Is a one-size-fits-all approach really going to be good enough here? The answer is a pretty resounding not really. Because here's the thing, even if someone can't make a complex medical choice, they absolutely can have their own unique values, they can cherish relationships, they can experience joy. So really thoughtful best interest approach has to take their subjective world into account. It ends up looking a whole lot like trying to understand what they, as a unique person, really care about. Okay, so let's circle back to that central mystery we started with in Section 4, a conflict through time. This is where it gets really, really interesting. What in the world do you do when the person who wrote the directive and the person now living with its consequences are in total opposition? Let's make this real. Let's talk about a patient we'll call Margaret. At 65, Margaret is a sharp, independent professor. Her entire identity is built around her intellect. So she writes a clear directive. If she gets dementia, she doesn't want her life prolonged. She sees that as a complete loss of self. But flash forward to age 80. Margaret has Alzheimer's. She's a different person. She finds real joy in her garden and listening to music. She's content. And by all appearances, she wants to continue living. So whose wishes do you follow? And boom, there it is, the core conflict laid bare. On one side, you have the autonomy of her past self, her right to control her own life story and avoid what she considered a terrible fate. But on the other side, you have the well-being of her present self, a person who is living a life filled with simple, daily pleasures. That neat little rulebook we talked about, it's not much help here. This throws us headfirst into Section 5, a deep, philosophical maze where we're forced to ask a really strange question. Who is the real patient? And the first big question we have to grapple with is about authority. Has the authority to make decisions actually shifted from the person she was to the person she is now? Well, one argument is this idea of a threshold of authority.
Basically, it says that the former, competent self had these higher-level abilities like autonomy that give it the right to make rules for the current, less capacitated self. So once you fall below a certain cognitive line, the past self's wishes should win out. But let's go even deeper. Let's ask a question that sounds like it's out of science fiction. Are they even the same person? This is what's called the personal identity challenge. And it's a wild thought. Some philosophers argue that what makes you over time is this continuous psychological link, your memories, your personality. If a disease like Alzheimer's causes such a massive break in that continuity, then maybe, just maybe, a totally new, different person is now inhabiting that body. And that leads us to the final, really thorny philosophical question. How much should the past actually matter to the person living in the present? This gets at something called the prudential concern challenge. Think about it. You care about what happens to you tomorrow because you know it's you. But if those psychological links between past and present are so broken that the two selves are basically strangers, why should the interests of the past self automatically apply to the present one, especially when their interests are now completely opposite? So, where does all this leave us? Well, it leaves us in Section 6, the unanswered question. Look, the whole point of this explainer wasn't to hand you a simple answer, because frankly, a simple answer doesn't exist. The point was to show you just how incredibly profound the question itself really is. I mean, look at the questions we've wrestled with. Whose interests matter more, the past self or the present self? At what point does a person change so much that maybe their own directives shouldn't apply anymore? Are they even fundamentally the same person from beginning to end? And the big one, how on earth do you balance respecting someone's autonomy with making sure they have well-being? So I want to leave you with one final thought. Put yourself in that room. In a situation like Margaret's, if you were the one who had to make that impossible call, whose voice would you listen to? The fighter from the past or the contented person sitting right there in the present?